to learn a little bit about the histories and the legacies of slavery here in New Jersey. I've done a couple of these presentations for the Wayne Public Library. We always have a really great turnout and get really interesting questions for the audience. So I'm looking forward to that part of it. And thanks to the New Jersey Historical Commission and the Passaic County Historical Organization for supporting the talk. I think it's a great way to learn more about the state, and certainly as we celebrate Black History Month, I don't think the timing of this presentation is a mistake. You know, the history of slavery in New Jersey is a really rich one, and an important one. I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen here. And I think it's one that is not really well understood at Kean University, where, as Carol said, I'm currently serving as dean. I've been serving as dean for quite a while, which is a role that I really enjoy, although it keeps me out of the classroom maybe a little bit more than I would like. We've incorporated, just this past year, we've been able to do it as we've transitioned primarily to remote instruction, a unit particularly on slavery within the Livingston family, slavery and the lives of the enslaved, particularly with an eye towards Liberty Hall and then those in the Kean family. And you know, when we asked the students about it, we did some follow-up and some metacognition projects with them after that unit. We were really surprised. Maybe we shouldn't have been, but we were at how few students really knew very much at all about Black history in New Jersey. And certainly the history and legacies of slavery in New Jersey's history. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk about it with you all. Presentation will have some kind of broad strokes. You know, the numbers do matter at some level, and so I'll try and share those a little bit. But it's also, I think, very important to remember that these are human beings that we're talking about. These are people who lived and loved and labored and struggled under very trying circumstances throughout their lives. It is very difficult to capture those lives in their own words in many cases. The few opportunities that we do have are very precious to us, but we'll talk a little bit about some of the sources that we do have that can tell us a little bit more, and then the ways that we use records from someone like Governor Livingston and others to try and understand the lives of the enslaved without just having a focus from kind of an elite white perspective. In 1849, an enslaved Black woman made her escape from the eastern shore of Maryland to Philadelphia. This was, I wouldn't say it's a common occurrence, but this was the route that many enslaved Blacks in the Upper South, particularly in Maryland and Virginia, would take along what we now know as the Underground Railroad and what even then was called the Underground Railroad. When she reached Philadelphia, and Philadelphia symbolized freedom, it by no means was that freedom for Blacks completely secure, but it was certainly more secure than it would have been down on the eastern shore of Maryland. She quickly came to realize that liberty and freedom meant little without the people that she loved. And so she vowed then to return back to the eastern shore of Maryland, back to the areas where she came from, and bring away her family and close friends as well. And so she tapped into what one historian has called an already well-oiled Underground Railroad network, and she succeeded overwhelmingly in bringing her friends and family to freedom in the North. And so over a 10-year period, we're talking about between 1850 and 1860, this woman, probably won't surprise you to know, is Harriet Tubman, directly assisted 60 to 70 people, mostly family and friends. She herself recorded 9 expeditions into the South. Although Harriet Tubman never went into the Deep South, she pretty much confined herself to the eastern shore of Maryland and that specific area, which again isn't too far from Philadelphia. And you know, those were the networks that she knew, but that's also where her friends and family were. She also provided detailed instructions to at least 60 or 70 other freedom seekers who found their way to freedom on their own, but certainly with her guidance and with input from her. Harriet Tubman's primary connection to New Jersey is that she worked for a time, at least one summer and perhaps more, in Cape May, New Jersey, where she earned money to pay for her expeditions down south. And the timing of this was fortuitous. Cape May, of course, was primarily a summer vacation spot. It was even a summer vacation spot in the mid-19th century. And Tubman made her expeditions back to the eastern shore of Maryland overwhelmingly in the winter. She wanted to go when it was when there was less daylight and more darkness, when the weather would keep people inside, and being able to move at night was more practicable for her. And so that setup worked pretty well. So Harriet Tubman is probably the most famous enslaved person with a strong New Jersey connection. The house picture there on the right is the new museum. That museum was opened virtually under COVID protocols in September of 2020. So I haven't had the opportunity to get to visit it, but it is something I'm looking forward to doing once we're able to travel and get out and about more. But it does serve as an important resource for her legacy. Governor Murphy and a number of other dignitaries were there at the opening. Harriet Tubman's story is not the only one. We don't, and she's exceptional in so many ways, and assisting 60 or 70 enslaved men and women to freedom and helping to facilitate 60 or 70 more is significant, is important. Certainly for their lives, it was overwhelmingly significant. But at the same time, we do need to acknowledge that there were lots of men and women who continued to be enslaved, who were enslaved until 1865, the end of the American Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery once and for all, and that there were even men and women who were enslaved within New Jersey. I'm trying to bring up the chat. Instead, I did that. What are we doing here? Sorry, I can't find the chat question. Here we go. Yeah, that's in Cape May. I don't believe it was her home. I think it's the location where she worked. They're still kind of doing the genealogical and the other work on that, but that's the site for the museum. So I want to emphasize, first and foremost, the history of slavery in New Jersey, I think, has always defied an easy explanation. I talked about it at the beginning, how, we were surprised at how few students, even New Jersey residents, understood slavery. In many ways, the history of slavery in New Jersey is similar to that in the Upper South and in the other border states. But, in New Jersey, one of the things we'll talk about is that the geography of slavery is reversed, and that you were much more likely to find enslaved men and women living and working in the northern and northwestern counties. There's a much greater enslaved population in Morris County, Bergen County, Hunterdon County, and Essex, closer to New York City, and those commercial connections there. And of course, in southern New Jersey, where you had a stronger Quaker influence, you had a lower number of enslaved population, and we'll talk about that. But by even in the 17th century, you have fairly significant slaveholders. So Lewis Morris of Shrewsbury, it seems to be the largest 17th century slaveholder that we have on record in New Jersey, and he claimed ownership over 60 or 70 enslaved persons. He had planting interests in Barbados and elsewhere, so he was extraordinarily wealthy. And we talk about the legacies of slavery. His nephew, who was also Lewis Morris, would later be the first royal governor of New Jersey, and Morris County is named after him. And certainly his ownership of slaves was not his only defining characteristic. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about the naming and renaming of buildings, of places, of institutions for slaveholders and slave owners. But, just understanding that Morris County in northern New Jersey, probably not a place we necessarily associate with slavery, but the county is named for a man whose wealth and whose generational wealth came in part, at least, through his ownership, his family's ownership of enslaved men and women. And I think that's that's really important to note. Slavery would continue to grow throughout the 18th century. The two primary entree points for slaves into New Jersey, one is in Camden, and that plaque there marks the dock area in Camden, of course, right opposite Philadelphia, coming up the Delaware River, where ships that would carry a cargo of slaves would unload. You typically did not get a large number of enslaved men and women coming direct from Africa being sold in New Jersey, simply because the market was so small compared to what you would find in Virginia or South Carolina, New Orleans, and certainly the British Caribbean. So most often what you got were African Americans, not necessarily native-born African, or if they were native-born African, they had been Creolized, so they had lived on a plantation, and then were being resold into New Jersey. And the slave trade was further facilitated compared to some of New Jersey's neighboring colonies, because the import duty was eliminated on the import of slaves in New Jersey. So you would have had to pay a duty in Philadelphia, you would have had to pay a duty in New York, but not necessarily in New Jersey. The building on the right is in Perth Amboy. It's actually the governor's house. I couldn't find an image that I thought worked really well. But Perth Amboy was the other primary port. I don't know that we think of Perth Amboy as a port, but the other dock area where enslaved Africans and African Americans would most likely be brought into New Jersey. And it didn't take long for enslaved men and women to be a really central part of the population. In 1740, Hunterdon County, a report from Hunterdon County, so this is 1740, noted, quote, 3/4 of the corn that was planted and hoed, the flax that was raised and dressed, and other work done was performed by Negro slaves. Another assessment in the 1770s noted that all but one household out of 300 in Perth Amboy, including one enslaved person. So that's all but one out of 300. So, you're not going to find the huge plantations, and maybe that you think of if you think of slavery in South Carolina or Virginia or the Mississippi Delta. But we talked about Lewis Morris early on, claimed ownership 60, 70, maybe more enslaved men and women. That was certainly the largest holding in New Jersey, but that's a sizable holding. And they are very central to the life and the labor of the colony. So just to give you a number overall, the population of enslaved men and women in New Jersey was about 5,000 in 1745, and it would rise to 14,000 by 1790. And so that's roughly between 7 and 8% of the state's population. So again, not overwhelming, but dispersed throughout, largely, as I said, in the northern counties, but dispersed throughout. 3/4 of them lived in the northern counties, what was then called East Jersey, what we would call North Jersey now, and fewer in the southern counties because of the Quaker influence. There were multiple slave rebellions in New Jersey. The first one that we have a record of was in Somerville in 1734, and then another one in Hackensack in 1741. There's a much larger slave uprising, which is what this image is depicting, in New York City in 1741. And there's multiple slave rebellions in different parts of the colony, 1739, 1740, 1741, and that's because of the outbreak of hostilities between Britain against both France and Spain, and enslaved men and women. We see this time and time again. We'll talk about it particularly with regard to the American Revolution and the American Civil War, but it happens at other times as well. Would take advantage of military conflict, take advantage of times when you might have more militia engaged in fighting elsewhere, and so less around, and just the general kind of tensions that you find in communities as a result of the conflict to try and stage their rebellions. There would also be additional conspiracies repressed in Perth Amboy in 1772, again, another time of rising tensions, and in Elizabeth in 1779, during the fighting of the American Revolution. That's one that I feel like I should know more about, and I don't know more about, so that's on my list to investigate. It's part of the larger project with regard to William Livingston that I'm studying. In South Jersey, by the 1760s, the Quakers essentially indicate that you could be a Quaker or you could hold blacks in bondage, but you could not do both. And so we see Quakers, some of them manumitting their slaves, some do sell their enslaved property, the men and women that they claimed ownership over, basically saying, I'm going to stay a Quaker, but not willing to give up that profit from selling their slaves. And other Quakers basically stop attending meeting and no longer consider themselves Quakers in order to maintain their slave holdings. But again, as I said, 3/4 of the enslaved population, so 3/4 of that 14,000, and probably higher than that by 1790, would have been in the northern part of the colony, and now the state, right? Perhaps the most famous slave rebel in New Jersey during the period of the American Revolution is an enslaved man, Titus, who comes to be known as Colonel Ty. And if you look there, that's the advertisement in the New York paper, but also that would have circulated in New Jersey. New Jersey didn't have its own newspaper until 1777. And if I'll read it, but you can see it there: £3 reward, run away from the subscriber, John Corliss there at the bottom. Living in Shrewsbury, right? So right where we talked about Lewis Morris and his family's legacy. In the county of Monmouth, a Negro man named Titus, but may probably change his name. 21 years of age, not very black, near 6 feet high. Talks about what he's wearing, and whoever takes up said Negro, secures him in any jail, or brings him to me, shall be entitled to the above reward of £3 and all reasonable charges. And of course, we know that in 1775, the American Revolution is not officially broken out, but fighting has already started in New England, and certainly tensions are peaking between the colonies and the British. Now, what's interesting about Colonel Ty is when he runs away from the man that claimed ownership over him, he ultimately flees to Staten Island, where the British garrison is based throughout most of the American Revolution, and he sides with the British. And this is a rational choice that an enslaved man would make. It was very reasonable for Colonel Ty to ultimately decide that his best chance at freedom, and as we'll talk about, his opportunity for revenge against his slave master would come by siding with the British. And so if we want to talk about if we want to talk about the history of slavery, we need to understand that for enslaved men and women, many of them chose to be loyalists and sided with the British. Colonel Ty would come to be considered the most successful militia commander that operated with the British in New Jersey. And we know this because he was one of the very, very few militia commanders that British regulars would operate with. Typically, British regular military forces didn't think very highly of militia. They didn't trust them. They might take one along because they would know the roads and the surrounding areas a little bit, the paths to whomever they were trying to attack, or whomever they might be trying to capture on a raid. But they acted in close collaboration with Colonel Ty. And one of the reasons that we know that is that ultimately Colonel Ty was killed in a raid. He operated multiple successful raids into Monmouth County before being shot while on a raid to try and capture and kidnap a New Jersey militia captain. And this was a joint British regular and militia operation. And so Colonel Ty was killed. I think it was 1779 or 1780, but he was among the most successful and is an important name to know in the Black history of New Jersey for sure. There were enslaved men and women who did side or tried to side with the Patriot forces. One of the ones that we know best about is a man who appears in the records as Samuel Sutphen. And Samuel Sutphen was essentially served as a substitute for his owner. So instead of his owner serving in the military, his owner sent him, and he was promised his freedom at the end of the war. Sutphen served in multiple engagements, many here in New Jersey. I think he was at the Battle of White Plains as well in New York. And he served with distinction until 1780, but instead of receiving his freedom at the end of the war, he was resold to another man. A number of his officers actually tried to convince that man, Peter Van Eyck, and this is out in Somerset County, to go ahead and free him, but Van Eyck would not agree to do so, and ultimately Sutphen purchased his freedom in 1805. As he grew older, he made multiple petitions to the New Jersey state government for a pension. As a Revolutionary War veteran, as a white soldier and veteran, he would have been entitled to that pension. Sutphen was denied multiple times until ultimately in the 1830s he was granted a pension. So this is another story of an enslaved man, a Black man who served on the Patriot side, but perhaps wasn't given due justice for his service. One of the main projects that I'm involved with at Kane and in my roles as a historian and as dean is involving William Livingston. My history colleague Beth Hyde and I received a multi-year National Endowment for the Humanities grant for a project that we call William Livingston's World. William Livingston, of course, his home, the home that he built in what was then Elizabeth, now Union Liberty Hall, is on Kane University's campus. And so we use that as a primary point of study. We have a number of his letters, even letters that don't appear in the published correspondence or the correspondence collected by the New Jersey Historical Association and others. William Livingston was undeniably a slave owner, and certainly the Livingston family, even more than him, much of the wealth of the Livingston family, who was in many ways the first family of New York. Livingston was a lawyer in New York for many years until he retired and retired to Elizabeth. The generational wealth of the Livingston family was absolutely related to slavery and the slave trade. And I use this document here as an example. This is from 1782, and this is for clothing, if you see here, related to shoes in particular. So he talks about for my wench, for uppers, my Negro boy, for uppers, and then mending Negro boots. So this is a clear indication that there were Black men and women, and they would have been enslaved men and women in the Livingston household in 1782. And we know that they were there. We know that they were there earlier as well. Livingston would grapple with the institution of slavery throughout his life. This is a study that we're deeply enmeshed in, and one that we take very seriously, is very important to us, and one that we're still trying to figure out. Livingston was the first popularly elected governor of New Jersey. He was first elected in 1776 and was reelected annually until his death in 1790. And Livingston's story can really tell us a lot about both the public debates over the institution of slavery in New Jersey and kind of his own private wrestling with the institution of slavery as well. We have correspondence between Livingston and a Quaker ally, Samuel Allinson, in which the two men kind of talk about slavery and the politics of slavery. And the shorthand version essentially is that Livingston shares that he would prefer to see slavery abolished in some form or other in New Jersey by the late 1770s and certainly into the 1780s. But the political reality was that it was too politically unpopular. Certainly in the northern states, certainly among wealthy New Jersey landowners and residents in the northern counties of the newly independent state. And so we have a number of letters of Livingston basically saying, I'm doing what I can, but he recognized that the majority of, certainly of the political class, wealthy whites in New Jersey, was opposed to the abolition of slavery. So Livingston, in one of his letters, wrote that slavery was, quote, particularly odious and disgraceful among Americans who had idolized liberty, but he was regularly and repeatedly forced to compromise and postpone a general manumission law. This is a letter. It's not the best photocopy of William Livingston, and you see he's writing from Elizabethtown, so he would have been writing from Liberty Hall, and he's writing to the New Jersey Society, the New Jersey Manumission Society. The New Jersey Manumission Society was co-founded by his son-in-law, John Jay, among others. Livingston's efforts to get a New Jersey Manumission Society started, or the efforts of other people, had proven to be unsuccessful. And so in this letter, we see Livingston writing to the New York Manumission Society and basically asking to become a member of it, and if essentially membership would be granted to someone living in another state. He says, I can safely promise that neither my tongue nor my pen nor purse shall be wanting to promote the abolition of what to me appears so inconsistent with humanity and Christianity, and so inevitably perpetuating of an indelible blot with all the nations of Europe upon the character of those who have so strongly asserted the unalienable rights of mankind. We do know that Livingston, we have the manumission document of him setting free a woman and her son who had been enslaved to him in 1785. And so we believe that by that time, late in the game, but by that time, Livingston had manumitted any and all of the men and women who were enslaved to him. His children did, however, continue to own slaves, and we have a letter from his daughter Kitty, who was newly widowed in 1789, who had married a wealthy man from Baltimore, actually. And because of that estate, and because none of their children were of age, she was overseeing the estate at that time. She writes a letter to her father, to William Livingston, basically asking if she can come back home. She's newly widowed and wants to move back out of Baltimore and come back to Liberty Hall. And she basically writes him a letter that discusses the 4 enslaved men and 1 woman, I believe it is, that she wants to bring with her, and that, essentially, saying that, this one is a good cook, one she didn't find particularly trustworthy, but still wanted to bring. And we have a reply from Livingston in which he says he agrees to it, in part because he says he's had trouble finding good household help since setting his slaves free. So these are not men and women, and Kitty does come home and bring these men and women enslaved to her with her. So again, William Livingston by 1786 has set free his slaves, but he's still benefiting from the labor of the enslaved, and continues to struggle with it literally all the way up until his death. Livingston is also one of the 5 delegates that New Jersey sends to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. He's pressed into service after several other New Jersey nominees declined to attend. So he's not one of the first choice, but he remains arguably the most prominent name, even if he's kind of coming towards the end of his life and political career. And he plays a prominent role, one that's not widely known, but a prominent role in Philadelphia. At the Constitutional Convention, Livingston was, by all accounts, a poor public speaker. He seems to have had kind of a high-pitched voice. He was far more comfortable as a writer. He was probably the most gifted propagandist produced by in the American Revolution, not just in New Jersey, but anywhere. And so, according to James Madison and others whose records we have, he didn't make much impression upon the oral debates, but given his recognized leadership qualities and given the acknowledgement of the quality of his intellect, he chaired two important committees at the convention, one overseeing the assumption of state debts and the other one that oversaw the issue of slavery. And it was that issue of slavery, that really was the most divisive at the Constitutional Convention. And so Livingston brokers a compromise over, particularly over the slave trade. And this is the continuation of the importing of enslaved men and women from Africa, or conceivably from the West Indies, into America. And actually, Livingston got a better deal in his committee overseeing this than they were able to get before the full convention. So Livingston actually gets the committee to agree that the slave trade would be continued only until 1800. This is in 1787. It wouldn't be ratified till 1788. That the importation of the international slave trade would be allowed to continue only until 1800, and at that time Congress could abolish it if they chose to do so. And in the full convention, basically this is South Carolina saying that they would only agree to ratify the Constitution if imports would be continued until 1808, and the full convention agrees to that compromise. And on January 1st, 1808, the international slave trade is officially abolished by the U.S. Congress. So here we see Livingston really playing a prominent role and actually brokering a better deal with regard to the institution of slavery and the slave trade than was ultimately acceptable to the convention. But again, this is a topic of real interest to us and one that we're spending some more time on. So New Jersey doesn't pass a gradual Emancipation Act until 1804. It is the last northern state to pass such a law. Massachusetts has passed Manumission by 1780, and even New York, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania all passed laws significantly sooner than 1804, sooner than New Jersey does. And so in talking about the history of slavery in New Jersey, and yes, New Jersey is a border state, even a northern state, but slavery hangs on here and hangs on a long time. That 1804 abolition, gradual emancipation law basically says that anyone born to an enslaved woman after January 1st, 1804 shall be freed on their 25th birthday if they're a man, or their 21st birthday if they are a woman. And the idea there being, of course, that by that time, the family, the men claiming ownership over an enslaved person would essentially have made their money, to think about it in a fairly callous way, but made their money on that enslaved man or woman, and then would be able to, and then they would be freed. But, what we see is that there's a number of unintended consequences. So there's a number of New Jersey slave owners who are unwilling to simply emancipate their slaves at the age of 25. And so we see actually an increase in enslaved men and women from New Jersey being sold down to Virginia, or even into the deep South here in the 19th century. So there was very much a sense, among a significant contingent of New Jersey slave owners that would not abide by the Emancipation Law, and even if they themselves had to get rid of their enslaved men and women, they were gonna do everything they could to get the full value for them. The other thing that we see is that in many instances, it's just a different degree of servitude that replaces slavery. And so we have one example of from John Kane, actually his widow, Susan Vanbrugh Livingston Kane Nimsevich, agreeing to emancipate to a man and a husband and wife who were enslaved to her in 1829 on the condition that they remain in service to her. And that's Peter and Sarah Van Horne. And this document that I'm showing now, to me, remains one of the most powerful ones that I've ever seen, and it certainly struck me on the first time I saw it, but even seeing it here, it has the same. And so this is an agreement between Susan, and we see here Susan Nimsevich signing her name here, and then we see Peter Van Horne, and we see Sarah Van Horne, and we see a space for their mark, and we see that they make an X, indicating they're agreeing to a document that they clearly can't read, but they do sign it. And so they agree essentially to a salary of $50 a year, provided that they remain in service to Susan. So they are no longer slaves, enslaved to Susan, but has their day-to-day life really changed? Probably not. Is there a mental element, a psychological element to no longer being considered a slave? Perhaps there is, and that's not one that we want to discount. But at the same time, this is, for all of the sense of, freedom by no means for enslaved men and women was established in 1804. But to me, just seeing that X there remains really powerful to me. Another man that we want to talk about, particularly important with regard to the Underground Railroad, is William Still. He was born a free man. His father had earned his freedom. His mother actually had been enslaved and was purchased prior to his birth around 1820. He worked in a clerk in Philadelphia. He was very active in the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, which was a Quaker organization, an organization that would also affiliate itself quite closely with the emerging women's rights movement in Seneca Falls in the 1830s and 1840s, and still became, I think, is widely considered to be the most successful conductor of the Underground Railroad. And you see in that image on the right, essentially, spanning the entire scope of New Jersey, a number of Underground Railroad stops, safe houses, locations along the way. My son went to a Quaker elementary school, and I'm pretty sure that meeting has been around since 1776. And I never did the actual research, but I'm quite sure that the Westfield Friends School was among the way stations on the Underground Railroad. We know that there's a number of them in Camden. Some of them are being preserved. But you can see the important role that New Jersey played. This makes sense, of course, given the proximity to Maryland and Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay Area in particular, and certainly in the 1850s with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law that made it much easier for Southerners to come north and recapture or reclaim ownership over men and women that they said had run away from them. Or Philadelphia would have been safe for Harriet Tubman in 1849. It was significantly less safe in 1851, and so many men and women who were seizing their own freedom would have gone through New Jersey on their way to upstate New York, where they were more protected, and in many cases into Canada. We know, for example, that Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman spent time in southern Ontario, across the border into Canada, where they were beyond the reach of American laws and southern slave owners. And so William Still is another name that's probably not nearly known as well as it could be or should be or needs to be. New Jersey's legacy. I think this image is a little bit stark, but it appeared in a popular media article that I saw, and I thought it kind of captured the idea, so I went ahead and used it. New Jersey's status is always complicated around the Civil War, because, as we said, that the state did cling to the idea of slavery and to certainly the elements of slavery well into the 19th century. There's still about 50 men and women who are enslaved in New Jersey in 1861 at the start of the American Civil War, that 1860 census. So this is men and women who were born before 1804 and whose owners hadn't seen fit to manumit them or to emancipate them. And so there were men and women living as slaves in New Jersey at the start of the American Civil War. New Jersey, of course, is the only state that didn't succeed, but neither did they give a majority of their votes for Lincoln in either the 1860 or the 1864 election. That's been used as shorthand to show that there was a lot of Southern sympathy in New Jersey. I think to a certain extent that is overstated. I don't think New Jersey is a pro-slavery state in 1860, but I think it also does highlight the persistence of racism and the persistence of a belief in enslaved labor in New Jersey, even into the second half of the 19th century, which is I think incredibly recent. There were 88,000 New Jersey soldiers that served under arms in the American Civil War, and nearly 3,000 of them were Blacks. African Americans could only officially serve in the Union Army following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That was not actually an edict of the original draft that Lincoln issued in September of 1862, saying that this would take effect in 1863. But he did make some revisions. Some were suggested by Frederick Douglass, among others, that would make it possible for Black men to serve in the Union Army in the remainder of the war, and over almost 3,000 Blacks from New Jersey took advantage of that opportunity to serve in that capacity and did so with distinction. And that military service would prove an important touch point as Black citizenship was debated in the 14th Amendment, and those debates had continued on into the last several years when we've talked about citizenships. And then also the 15th Amendment that would give Black men, and only men, but Black men, the right to vote, that was ultimately passed in 1870. The service of Blacks in the Union Army in winning their own freedom and that military service as part of their claim to political rights would be really important. So to me, the history of slavery is there. It's front and center. We see it with the founding fathers of New Jersey. We see it with the large landowners of New Jersey, but we also see the ways in which it was threaded through all of these towns and all of these communities. It goes back from New Jersey's earliest years certainly as an English colony, and there's the large presence of enslaved Blacks even goes back to when New Jersey was a Dutch colony, even before it became an English colony in 1664. And the significant population of Blacks in Bergen County, which was a heavily Dutch area, and remains. They've done some archaeological work and some historical work in some of the different Bergen communities as well. So I threw a lot at you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.